Welcome to session 19. This is the session on funk and early hip hop with a subtitle of Refiguring the Body and Deconstructing Sound. The idea of reconfiguration and deconstruction will be our main theme for today. Reconfiguration is somewhat obvious what that would mean. The idea of taking something that is configured one way and changing it for whatever reason. Sometimes changing it can be as simple as wanting to try something different. Sometimes changing it can be a statement in a larger sense. That if you take something that has been figured in one fashion and you reconfigure it, you change it, are you saying something about the status of that thing? Are you making some kind of political statement about the way we usually understand it? Or even just an aesthetic, creative engagement with the thing that disrupts our usual way of looking at the world, which, after all, is a big part of art, right? The idea of seeing a painting of a landscape isn't just so that we have a substitute experience of a landscape. We could always just go out and see a landscape. The fact that we're looking at it as a painting disrupts our usual sense of how we look, what we look at, our attention, the way it's focused, the way it's framed. So reconfiguring is, in some ways, appropriate to many, if not all, arts. All arts, and maybe all of them, attempt in some fashion to reconfigure the way that we look at the world, the way that we are dealing with objects in front of us, reconfigure our very notion of what it is to deal with an object. An aesthetic object is not the same as a typical object. If I were to place a doorknob in an art museum for you to look at, and you insisted on grabbing it and trying to turn it to open a non-existent door, I would say that you were somehow not treating it as though it were an aesthetic object, but rather treating it as a tool, an instrumental object. So art is always reconfiguring what we think about objects. Deconstruction is something I'll come back to. In some ways, the 70s is a very important moment for questions about Black authenticity. We've already talked about the 60s and its impact on the rise of the Black Panthers and the changes that the civil rights movement underwent during that decade. In the 70s, just like we saw with other aspects of political and social life, the notion of Black authenticity becomes in some ways more mainstream and in some ways becomes more culturally differentiated than it had been perhaps in the 1960s. So, to some extent, this is a reinforcement of stereotype. To some extent, it's an attempt to get at a kind of essential nature of blackness. Of course, that's a much contested notion. And in some ways, it's an attempt to create a kind of cultural space and entertainment space for Black images that will sell not just to Black audiences, but also white audiences. And then in some cases, certain cultural products are intended primarily for Black audiences. One of the really interesting genres to emerge in the 1970s is the blaxploitation flick. And perhaps the first really important one is this one, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song by Melvin Van Peebles. It was written and directed and stars Melvin Van Peebles. It's a movie that concerns really the underbelly in some ways of life. It's about a young Black man who, as you can see from the cover there, you bled my mama, you bled my papa, but you won't bleed me. So there's an element of rebellion. The film involves murder. It involves male prostitution. So there's some sexual exploitation elements. There's certainly the exploitation of the notion of the violent and vigorous Black male. So it's playing on a lot of stereotypes, and yet is also designed in some ways in many ways, for Black audiences. So Black exploitation films, the two big ones, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song and then Shaft, which we'll talk about in a moment, they're considered something of a double-edged sword at the time. On the one hand, they're very popular, and they feature Blacks as main characters and Black communities as the main locations. On the other hand, they rely on certain ingrained stereotypes, including the notion of the heroic and over-sexualized criminal. So many of the characters are pushers and pimps and private detectives. The soundtracks are among the first to really emphasize funk and soul music, and the narratives deal with racial oppression and the violent, sometimes merely symbolic overthrow of the white overclass. So terms like whitey and honky and cracker as pejoratives, as insults, become very common in these films. Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song has a frame in it that looks like this. So notice that what we're seeing here, of course, is a woman in the throes of sexual ecstasy. You might not be able to quite tell that from this picture. The scene backs up and you can see what's happening. But notice that the idea here is that the film itself stars the black community, that is for the black community, featuring the black community, representing in some fashion the black community. Of course, it's a very narrow view of that community. And yet there is a sense with blaxploitation. Blaxploitation is a very strange genre in this way. There was a sense in which, on the one hand, it was exploitative. It was emphasizing negative stereotypes and things that people would just as soon forget. But on the other hand, it's at least creating a sense of visibility. It's creating a sense of actors that are finding recurring roles, as we'll see with Shaft, for instance. And so allowing a form of expression, however limited, to the black community. And you can see that that's a programmatic thing with this particular frame, starring the black community. The most famous of the blaxploitation films, and arguably the best, is of course Shaft from 1971. Shaft has a soundtrack that we'll return to in a moment by Isaac Hayes. Actually, we'll listen to a little bit of it right now. Let's hear the main theme from Shaft, just the opening of it. Notice the drums with the hi-hats, a little bit like a disco sound, but then that guitar comes in. The wah, of course, was also typical of disco, and yet this is clearly more of a funk-based sound. Now, I'd like you to try to see the opening of this film if you can find it online. When you hear this opening song, what you're seeing is the main character, John Shaft, who's a private detective, moving his way through the streets of New York. He's depicted very much as a sort of black flaneur. A flaneur is a figure of the metropolis, a figure of the city, who moves smoothly within those spaces, who forces the flow of the crowd to conform to his desired motions. Notice the way that this song slowly builds. We keep adding elements. There's a very cinematic element to this, of course. But it also builds the intensity without changing the basic groove. And so it gives us a sense of urgency as we watch John Shaft move through the streets of New York. But it also gives us a sense that it's all the same, that building intensity is not so much about him as about the landscape in which he finds himself. Now, I'll expect you to listen to the rest on your own. Of course, we haven't gotten to the really famous part where the fellow says, Shaft is one bad mother, and then the girl singers cut him off, watch your mouth, and then he says, I'm just trying to talk about Shaft. So this sense of Shaft being a badass is a very important element of this movie and of the song. This is an important moment for Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes has been working for a while at Stax Records as a songwriter, but really hasn't had any success in his own right until the 1969 album, Hot Buttered Soul, which was a pop number 8 and an R&B number one. So a number one on the R&B charts and a number eight on the pop charts, a very high scoring or highly rated album. And it's a good example of the sound that he will then cultivate for the rest of his career, to quite a lot of success. Let's hear a little bit of a song called "By the Time I Get to Phoenix" from that album to get a sense of what that sound is. So notice that sustained tone on the organs, the kind of sexy baritone delivery. At first thing, the talking.
I'm going to tell you what love can do. You know when they say love makes the world go round, that's the truth.
Something in between, kind of almost a testifying, but also a kind of almost crooner kind of aesthetic in the narration at first.
It can make you happy, it can make you sad.
But let's move into the song a little bit. This is, by the way, this is an 18-minute song, so it builds very slowly over the course of it.
Anything that this woman's heart desires, anything that you can kick a dog around, myself and that girl.
And eventually gets to the singing. Notice the big orchestral arrangement. Elements of jazz, elements of a kind of, you can see why he was picked to write the soundtrack for Shaft. He's got a very cinematic feel to his music in general, the use of the orchestra, the jazz references, and so on. Another important blaxploitation film is the next one, and that's, of course, Superfly. And the soundtrack for that was done by Curtis Mayfield, one of the very important R&B figures of this move from the late 60s into the early 70s. It also combines guitar and strings. And Curtis Mayfield, he has a huge impact on the late 60s and early 70s as far as connections between the black and white community. He becomes a kind of ambassador in some ways to the white community. He appears on a lot of different television variety shows and has this kind of accessibility that makes him very popular. He had much more of a crossover appeal than, say, James Brown. At least at this point in his career. Let's hear a little bit of the song Superfly from that soundtrack. Actually, let's not do that one. Let's do Pusher Man, the more famous song. Now, there's some really interesting elements to the song if we were to listen to it all the way through and really think about it and see it in the context of the movie. It's clearly about a drug dealer. I'm your pusher man, and there's an element here of a kind of seductiveness, as you can hear. There's also a gift of gab, right? The way that the lines blur together, that one runs right into the next. You get the sense that this character that he's building is someone who can convince you to do things that maybe you ought not to do. There's a kind of rhetoric of affability, a rhetoric of persuasion here in the character that Curtis Mayfield, I think, brings out really well. And then one can ask whether or not this is a glorification or just a representation, or if there's an element of irony that sort of tips the hand that tells us that maybe this isn't meant to be a positive illumination of the character. These are all things to think about, obviously. So funk is a return to dance music. It's a response in some ways, especially early on, to the notion of album art. James Brown's a good example here. He's the godfather of funk, and also he's so productive that a large part of his output has to do with singles. It's not that he didn't create great albums, he did, but the main focus, the fact that he was, one of the most one of the busiest people in show business was because he was pumping out all of these singles. And if you look at his discography, you'll see an incredible amount of output. The term itself appears in the early 70s. It connotes body odors. It appears in the early 70s with respect to music. The actual term itself goes back much further in history. It connotes body odors, particularly when it comes to the erogenous zones, the sexual zones, and therefore, along with that, a sense of authenticity, a sense of something being authentically the way that it is. The term funk was used in relation to other things. For instance, there was a club called the Funky Butt in early New Orleans, turn of the century New Orleans. But the application of that term to a genre of music begins in the 70s. This is music that involves repeated and interlocking patterns, call and response sections. The horn section functions primarily as an extension of the rhythm section, so they're not usually playing extended melodies, but rather adding to the hits, the rhythmic hits, and we'll hear some examples of that in just a moment. One of the great, obviously the godfather of soul and of funk, is James Brown. Here you can see him at two different points in his career. The picture to the left is obviously showing him in full action. Now, a huge part of the sound of James Brown, once he's moving more into what we would think of as the funk phase of his career, has to do with this next fellow. Here you see Bootsy Collins, a rather young Bootsy Collins playing his bass, and then another picture has Bootsy Collins standing behind James Brown. Bootsy Collins, of course, the great bass player, one of the, along with the bass player from Sly and the Family Stone. Bootsy Collins is one of the premier funk bass players. So there's Larry Graham from Sly and the Family Stone, and then Bootsy Collins. James Brown has this theory of the one, right? And we can already hear elements of funk coming into coalescence right at the end of the 60s and the early 70s. Let's hear a little bit of Superbad from 1970. This was a pop number 3 and an R&B number 1. And you'll notice that with James Brown songs, the pop chart listing is always going to be much higher than the pop listing. So the R&B will always be higher. So this is a number 1 R&B, number 13 pop. Part of that has to do with the fact that James Brown, for all of his success, never really was the crossover hit that other people such as Curtis Mayfield became. Here's a little bit of Superbad. Notice the horns there. The horns are hitting on... Now you might have noticed the horns hit in that opening. I'll back it up and you can hear it again. But the horns are hitting on 1 and then on, I think, the end of 2. Right? So that heavy hit on the 1. Notice the way that all of the instruments come in on that 1. Let's hear that again, and we'll talk a bit more about it in a moment. So the legend goes, of course, Bootsy Collins, very young, I think he was maybe 17, maybe 18, when he joined James Brown. He was already this very dexterous, very versatile bass player, and he, Bootsy Collins was from a family that they weren't exactly poor, but they weren't exactly rich either. and the mother was very worried about the other brother, and he told James Brown that he could only join that band if he found a job for his brother as well. And so, I mean, this is a guy who, and that's not the demand that an unknown bass player makes, obviously. So this is a guy who obviously James Brown thought highly of. And the legend is that he first shows up and he's playing all this amazing stuff, and James Brown says, "No, man, it's got to be about the one. Well, you got to give me at least the one, right?" That it was throwing him off that there was all this stuff happening without a clear designation of the one. And so what's happening is a shift from 2 and 4 toward the one as the real emphasis. And this simple reorientation of the beat allows the remainder of the measure to be relatively free with respect to syncopation and so on, and yet still drive that groove. Here's an example of one of the bass lines of Bootsy Collins. This is Soul Power. Let's hear a little bit of it. Now you can see in the transcription of at least part of the bass line that he sometimes doesn't articulate the third beat. In fact, quite a bit he leaves the third beat blank. But that first beat is not only articulated, but it's often accentuated through the 16th notes leading into it. So the forcefulness of the one. This can sound like the kind of thing that is much ado about nothing. But if you watch almost any interviews with Bootsy Collins on YouTube or through other venues, you'll see he's constantly referring to this idea of the one and how important that was to James Brown's sound and to what Bootsy Collins added to that sound. In 1973, then, funk really explodes. There are several huge hits from that year. One is Jungle Boogie by Kool and the Gang. Let's hear just the opening of that. Notice the rips in the horns there, the brep, brep, right? Mostly a percussive thing. It's not, that's clearly not a melody. It's not a mode of any sense. It's reinforcing the rhythmic drive of the track. Here, just a little bit more of that. That wonderful bass line that then gets reinforced by the horns. So notice that the horns really don't have their own identity in this music for the most part. They're either doubling the bass or they're contributing to the percussive underlay of the song. Another important tune from that that period, it's actually from a year later, is of course the Ohio Players with Fire. Those of you who are into hip-hop music might recognize the Ohio Players. A lot of the backing tracks, a lot of the samples from the late 80s into the early 90s come from them. Here's a little bit of that tune. I like that track for a number of reasons. Notice that when you're first listening to it, you might not have a clear sense of the orientation of that downbeat, but once it kicks in, you never lose it again. Once you realize where it is, they reinforce it more and more, they drive it home more and more. Here are those three bands that that are mentioned on the other side: Kool and the Gang, Wild Cherry, and the Ohio Players. And here's Bootsy Collins with Parliament Funk, Parliament Funkadelic. So Bootsy Collins hooks up with George Clinton, and you can see George Clinton in the lower left there with the multicolored hair, the rainbow-colored hair. This is a slightly later period. This isn't from the 70s so much. Let's look at the next slide. Here's George Clinton in the 70s, and you can see he tends to wear these outlandish outfits, the cowboy hat. He's an over-the-top character, and one of the things that Bootsy Collins suggests is that he brought this theory of the one to Parliament, and that it really changes their style of music. We'll talk a little bit more about George Clinton in a second, but he's not just a frontman for a major funk band. He's also an entrepreneur, a very important music entrepreneur. Another important figure in Parliament Funkadelic is, of course, Bernie Worrell, the great keyboard player, a big part of that sound. And so Parliament Funkadelic was really in some ways two bands. There was Parliament and there was Funkadelic. And part of the reason that they were both bands by George Clinton, he wound up being challenged over the use of the name Parliament. And that's part of why he established the other band. And then he winds up joining the two names. And you can see there's a very theatrical sensibility here. You can see that they're wearing costumes and masks and so on. And as we'll see in a moment, some of them even play characters on stage. Let's move forward. So this is a group that George Clinton has with Bootsy Collins and Maceo Parker of James Brown and Bernie Worrell on the keyboards. They recorded for Casablanca Records, which you might remember was a major record company for disco. It's also where the band Kiss recorded. And they had 5 LPs in the top 40 between 1976 and 1978. So again, pretty major production. But unlike James Brown, they really are much more of an album-driven group. So they're really thinking of the album as art in the way that other groups were in the 70s. 2 of these albums went platinum. They have these wild shows with elaborate costumes and sets. There's a flying saucer on one tour that comes in, and it's called the Mothership. And then Dr. Funkenstein, one of the alternate personalities of George Clinton, descends from the ship. You should look for this online. I'll try to find the clip and send it around. There are other characters. There's Star Child. There's the villain, which is Sir Nose devoid of funk, right? So Sir Nose devoid without any funk. So these are concept albums, and their biggest crossover single, of course, is this one. This is Give Up the Funk, Tear the Roof Off the Sucker, which was pop number 15, which might not seem that high, but it was pretty high for them, and an R&B 5, and this is from 1976. Let's hear just a bit of it. Notice the way they really lay into that one, especially on these beats right there. And I think this is a good example of a band that really combines various elements of the 70s. It's obviously drawing on James Brown and the funk movement and R&B in general, but it's also drawing on elements of psychedelia, at least as far as the concept album, the insistence on the concept album, the big production sound. You can hear in other tracks that there are these stories that are being told through the songs and so on. And George Clinton, like I said, he becomes really an entrepreneur. He begins producing a slew of other bands, and many of these are basically spin-off bands of his groups. One of my favorite albums by Funkadelic is Maggot Brain. And Maggot Brain, the title track, is an amazing guitar piece. Let's hear a little bit of it. And it features Eddie Hazel on the guitar. Let's hear a bit of him playing.
Mother Earth is pregnant for the third time, for y'all have knocked her up. I have tasted the maggots in the mind of the universe. I was not offended, for I knew I had to rise above it all, or drown in my own shit.
Now, if you weren't convinced of the psychedelia comparison in the last track, see what you think of this track. There's the various effects, the reverb, the echo effects. And then after setting the mood here with the accompaniment, this somewhat Hendrix inspired, but also somewhat blues inspired, obviously, guitar lead. The whole track is amazing, and you really should try to spend some time with it. So clearly, Parliament, a lot of what they're doing in Funkadelic, a lot of what they're doing is about dance music, but not all of it. Some of it is drawing on the psychedelia of the late '60s and early '70s. Here's the album cover for Mothership Connection, and you can see George Clinton there, and you see the mothership. Here he is as Dr. Funkenstein coming down from the mothership on a concert tour, and here he is as actually that's not him, that's someone else dressed up as Sir Nose devoid of funk, right? The villain. Now we're gonna leave funk music behind now and turn to another development of the late '70s into the early '80s, and that's of course the beginnings of hip hop. So now we're making our transition out of the '70s and into the '80s. But the beginnings of hip hop, the pre-recorded parts of hip hop, really are firmly grounded in the aesthetics of the '70s, and so I think it's appropriate to introduce that now. Let's turn to the first element. As you probably already know, there are 4 elements that people talk about with respect to hip hop culture in the wider sense. You of course have graffiti art, breakdancing, emceeing, and DJing. Right. So let's take a look at each of these. The beginnings of graffiti art, as far as the hip hop culture side of things was concerned, of course, graffiti goes back a long way. Those of you who have been to the Met and have seen the Temple of Dendur, which is in the Egyptian wing, you'll see graffiti that goes all the way back to the 1600s. So graffiti is very old as such, but graffiti art really begins in a rather modest way in New York City, in my old neighborhood of Inwood, and you can see one of the earliest tags here, and this is Julio 204, and this is because the fellow's name was Julio and he lived at 204th Street in Inwood. Notice that what's being done, and what Julio would do is, at first he would mostly just mark his own neighborhood, and it would just be sidewalks in the park or on the street, and it's just a way of sort of declaring, yourself, right? And it's sort of like signing the artwork that you never made, and this is how tagging sort of begins. It's a very interesting, I think, cultural phenomenon. Of course, as you know, especially in the 80s, there was an attempt to really crack down on it legally in New York, and an attempt to erase it as a sign of urban blight. But in a more almost quasi-romantic sense, what Julio's doing is he's leaving his mark as a kind of pure signature. He's signing an artwork that isn't there. He's making some kind of recognizable mark. I mean, tagging is such an interesting term anyway, right? If I tag something, I'm designating it in some way as something I can follow, as something that, at least in part, is either owned by me or at least followed by me and tracked by me, right? And so in tagging, I'm trying to leave behind a mark that I'm there. It's a call to presence. It's a call to the notion that I'm here and I'm alive and to be taken note of. But it quickly became much bigger than that. Here you can see graffiti art on a New York subway, and you see the fellow there with the teeth, and this is what's called bombing a subway car, and what that means is that you sneak into the area where the subways are parked at night. You jump the fence. Usually you have to cross some razor wire to get there. And you have your spray cans of paint, and you create this artwork. And then what happens the next day? They can't just retire the subway cars. At least at first, that's not how they did it. We'll talk about how they eventually took care of it. But at first, there's little they could do. The subway car that was needed was the subway car that was needed. So these cars would go out even with all this art on them, all of this graffiti on them. And the graffiti could be both inside and outside the car. And so one of the things that KRS-One, a very important early rap artist, talks about is that some of his friends would tag these subway cars or bomb them, the full paintings, right? And they would then look and watch as the train goes by in the elevated parts of the train system, and it's like your artwork is now traveling from place to place. So an artwork, for the most part, is a static thing. If I go to see a painting and it lives, it stays at the Met Museum, then I have to go see it there. I have to travel to it. But here, there's a sort of reversal that's happening with graffiti art, where it's the art that travels from neighborhood to neighborhood, and it's this sense of dispersion. But remember, it all began with a kind of tagging of an identifier of you in your neighborhood. So it's a way in which neighborhoods represent for each other. And these graffiti artists really become associated with certain groups, certain cliques that are associated with certain neighborhoods, sometimes as specific as specific blocks. And so this idea that you're sending your art out into the world was a major part of what graffiti art was all about. There's a really wonderful documentary from the time called Wild Style that you can see some of this being discussed in. Here you see some graffiti, not movable graffiti, this is against the wall, but in Hell's Kitchen. And you can see the emblematic way in which they're writing the words Hell's Kitchen, right? That the graffiti art is in some ways designating the neighborhood and defining the neighborhood. It's an expression of a kind of pride of the neighborhood. Notice it says both Hell's Kitchen and New York, right? It's this way of positioning oneself. You can also see on the trash can there, it says New York Fresh, right? Even, I think there's something kind of ironic there that they're painting a trash can and saying fresh, which of course is a reversal. Trash cans aren't usually known for their freshness, and yet what they're saying, of course, is that this style of art is fresh and is new and is exciting. The second main characteristic of early hip hop is of early hip hop culture is, of course, breakdancing. Now, just like we saw with graffiti art, there's a reversal involved here, or better yet, we're going to start using the term deconstruction. Now, deconstruction is one of those terms that people sometimes misuse. It doesn't mean simply taking something apart, but often people can also overly concern themselves with precise definitions, and I don't think that's necessarily important here. The main idea of deconstruction, which comes from a writer, philosopher, and literary theorist named Jacques Derrida, the main idea of deconstruction is that what it does is it plays out through reversal the contradictions that are inherent in the definition of the thing. So for instance, in the artworks that we were talking about, usually artworks are static and people have to come to them. And yet there's a sense in which artworks are attempting to communicate across several people, right? It's not a one-time communication. It's a communication that endures and that involves various relationships, usually of people coming to it. And what graffiti art does is it kind of, especially when you're dealing with the subway cars, is it reverses that, right? So it deconstructs it. It shows a certain tension that's in the thing and then plays with that tension. It reverses the normal hierarchy of things. Breakdancing is similar. For the most part, not all dancing, but a lot of dancing is meant to take these movements of the body and smooth them out. Again, not all dancing, but breakdancing certainly is not doing that. In fact, one of the things that is so interesting about especially early breakdancing is that it often freezes in certain poses, right? So it's if dancing is usually about motion and moving through space, breakdancing is about grabbing certain poses and holding them at times, so that you're breaking up this sense of continuity. You're breaking up this sense of what the body usually does, sort of mechanization of the body, as you can see in these examples, especially that second one. Another aspect, of course, of early hip-hop culture is DJing. In early DJ cultures, we'll talk about, for instance, in a moment with Kool Herc, but you can see it here as well, is it's usually in these public parks. So here you can see that they've set up their stand in a public park. Usually what they do is they tap into the public electric grid. Usually what you do is you go through a lamppost and hook up your equipment that way. So you're not dealing with a plug, obviously, an external plug. You're tapping into, you're stealing, in a sense, part of the electricity of the city. Of course, you're paying for it through taxes, so I suppose you could think of it as not stealing. But there's an element in which what you're doing is you're dealing with public utilities in a way that we are not usually encouraged to deal with them. But the other aspect of what a DJ does, of course, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, but they manipulate the recording. So they're using things that are pre-recorded, but they're manipulating them in various ways, usually through various techniques, like, for instance, backspinning. So the main idea of backspinning is that let's imagine that we have a break of a tune. Let's say it's a disco tune or whatever, like Chic's Good Times or something like that. And what you do with that is you find the drum break, which, let's imagine it lasts for, I don't know, 20 seconds. But you want that break to last longer so people can dance over it without the singing and everything else. So what you do is you have your two turntables and you have the one in motion, and then when it gets toward the end of the break, you raise up the levels on the other turntable, which is queued up to the beginning of that break, and then the break seamlessly moves over to the next record, and it seems like it's just continuing. Meanwhile, you backspin the original record so that it's ready to do it again. You can trade off for as long as you want. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is basic DJ technique. But the idea is what you've done is something actually quite philosophically interesting, I think. Because what you've done is you've taken these albums, which are kind of, they are inscriptions of permanence, right? When I play an album, let's say Dark Side of the Moon, it's always going to be Dark Side of the Moon. It's not going to change unless I scratch it or something else. But if I'm playing it as the album that it is, then it's always that. It's a product, right? But music, of course, is a process. So the album is a way of taking a process and making it into a product. And what hip-hop DJing does is it reverses that again. It takes the product and it makes it into a process. It makes it into something that I'm performing with, right? And this is one of the controversies of rap, as you probably already know, that people think of certain people at least think of DJs as being not musicians, because what they're doing is they're working with other people's products. But what we're saying here, what I'm saying, is that they are working with that. They're using it as their instrument. They are manipulating what is a product and returning it to a musical process. And then, of course, there's emceeing. as a fourth element of early DJ culture, and that is also a kind of reversal where the beginnings of MCing, as we saw already with uh, reggae culture, came from this habit of toasting, right? And there's a long sense of what the MC does at parties and performances, like for instance at the Cotton Club in the 1920s and early 30s in New York in the jazz scene, right? The MC would stand and would announce the songs that were coming up, but would also in this situation would announce people coming into the venue. Oh, here's so and so, usually someone famous, right? Here's so and so, Jimmy Durante or whatever, joining us here at the Cotton Club, and would make these announcements. But and the Toasters did things along those lines as well. They're at these more informal parties at first, at least in Jamaican reggae culture, and then in early hip hop culture, which is in some ways an extension of Jamaican culture, using the same tools that the Jamaican reggae culture used, the sound systems and so on, and then toasting. And so these toasts became more and more elaborate. There's a huge toasting culture over the course of the 70s where you would work out these rhymes that and incorporate people's names in them and so on, and it created a certain festive atmosphere, and this is what will develop into rapping. Of course, there's a, I think, significant difference between this early element and rapping, but we'll talk about that when we see the distinctions between party rap and the golden era of rap. And then I suppose there's a fifth element, really. The four are the main elements that we just went through. But in early hip hop, another element is, of course, beatboxing. And one of the really important beatboxers was this fellow, the Human Beatbox from the Fat Boys. Let's hear one of their tunes called the Human Beatbox.
Stick 'em, ha ha ha, stick 'em. Stick 'em, ha ha ha, stick 'em. Stick 'em, ha ha ha, stick 'em. Gonna run the beatbox in the best fucking rhythm. With the mind blowing body rocking TPMCs, all the homeboys and the young ladies are gonna rock a fist beat with the Human Beatbox. And to the sucker MCs, jump off our jocks. His DJ name is Grandmaster Doc Mac. Never repeat it if we have to, once or twice. We're gonna take it from the bottom and straight to the top. So check it out, party people, it's the Human Beatbox.
Okay, and so you get what's happening here is that the mouth and the articulations that the mouth can make becomes part of the percussion ensemble, right, of the performance. And beatboxing is another one of these reversals. What it's doing is exposing something that's very significant about language. Is any articulative language, meaning any language that isn't just sighs or some kind of continuous sound, any language that breaks up those vowel sounds with consonants is an articulative language. So there are percussive aspects. Think of B's and P's, right? Plosive sounds, p, p, or ba, ba. There, these little explosions that we create with our mouths. And we know, especially when people talk very fast or when people speak in certain patterns, we can hear the rhythmic aspect of the way that speech works on a daily basis. But for the most part, we ignore it. Like if you were to listen in a sort of abstract way to the things I'm saying now, there are all sorts of sounds that you kind of filter out. So for instance, the T sounds, the things that you filter out, right? That I can then exaggerate or underplay. But there's a lot of noise to language is what I'm trying to say here, right? And a lot of that noise we filter out. We don't pay attention to it because we're trying to pay attention to the sense of things. But language has a sonic element to it when it's spoken, and it is a sensuous element. And part of that element has to do with the clicking against the teeth of the tongue and the ways in which the lips smack and so on. And all these things that we might think of as pure noise are a major part of that. And so what beatboxing does is it kind of takes away the language part of it and reduces to simply the noise that underwrites everyday speech. One of the major figures of the beginnings of hip hop culture is Kool Herc from a Jamaican background, and basically he just ran these at first impromptu and then later rather organized parties. At first they were in the community center of his building, and then he began doing them in the parks, and he would tap into the electric grid, like I mentioned before, and create these impromptu parties, and then he eventually started promoting them and having people come to them, by design in that sense, charging a small amount of money and so on. And so he would spin these records, and sometimes people would toast over them or MC over them. And this is part of how the beginnings of the Bronx hip hop culture began, and it did begin largely in the Bronx. We may talk eventually about some people like Marley Marl from Queens who contest the idea that hip hop begins in the Bronx, but all the evidence points to the fact that it really did begin there. Here's Lovebug Starsky. He's one of the largely now forgotten MCs and DJs, but a very important figure in the beginnings of hip hop. And he's also very interesting in the economic system of how hip hop began. One of the reasons that the hip hop in some ways begins in the mid 70s, but doesn't really get recorded until the end of the 70s and early 80s, is because a lot of these DJs slash MCs like Lovebug Starsky didn't really want to lose his gig. He figured if his ideas got recorded, then why bother to hire him, right? That part of it is this live performance. Remember, the whole point was taking something that was a product, these other records, and then turning them into a kind of process, and that there was a performative element here. It wasn't just spinning records, that it was an engagement with the record. And so Starsky thought of this as a live performance practice, and he's one of the people that really didn't make the transition into recordings, and that's why he's forgotten. Another reason he didn't make the transition in the recordings, by the way, when as we'll see in a second, Sugar Hill Records, when they first approached people about making what is often considered the first real rap record, and we'll talk about it in a moment, they approached him. He said no. He was afraid that this would be something that would derail his career and not promote his career. DJ African Bambaataa is another very important early DJ. He does make the transition into recordings. He's not the first to record, but he's certainly one of the important early DJs. He's an interesting example of the beginnings of rap and the sort of party. We'll see all the people we're going to talk about are interesting. There are plenty of groups that may have been not as interesting in this era, but almost everyone at least, that we're going to talk about, I think really was interesting and worth thinking about in greater detail. And DJ African Bambaataa is very much one of those figures. He was interested in a much more eclectic form of DJing. One of the things that he liked to do, for instance, is use a beat, use a break, so an instrumental section that he would loop over and over again from an album that you wouldn't expect. So one of the things he'd like to do was, for instance, use the Monkees. He found several breaks in their songs and would have people dancing, black people at parties dancing to this break, and then he'd let it go a little further so the chorus would kick in, and people would come up to him and say, "Oh man, I can't believe I was just dancing to the Monkees," right? And he'd like to sort of play these games, so there was an interactive element between what he was doing and the people listening. He also founded the Zulu Nation in the early 70s, and he thought of this as a group based around the beginnings of hip-hop culture and street art and these non-violent gangs of young people who were getting together for kind of the social betterment, right? And so you have one of the things that's very important about Bambaataa is he's one of the people interested in what's sometimes referred to as Afrofuturism, the idea of taking black culture but applying it to kind of sci-fi elements. And you can hear that in one of his recordings called Planet Rock. Let's hear just a tiny bit of that. So the synthesizer is a marker of futurity, of the future. and you can hear the distortion, the synthesized version of his voice and so on. That's another song worth listening to in greater detail. Of course, one of the most important DJs of this era is DJ Grandmaster Flash. He's the one that really pioneers what he calls the quick mix theory, which involves various techniques, some of which Cole Herc was already employing, although not to the degree of technical skill that Grandmaster Flash developed. And that's really the most important thing. It's not that nobody had done backspinning before, but very few people worked it out and practiced it in the way that Flash did. And that's why it's called the quick mix theory. And he had ways of marking the records. He had ways of sometimes using a grease pencil, sometimes using something that he would tape to it. He had all sorts of ways of working out ideas. So he's got, of course, he perfects the backspin technique, where he was very exact with it, very skilled at it, and could take even really short segments, just a couple seconds long, and create actual breaks out of things that weren't really originally more than a couple measures of a break. He also works on punch phrasing a lot, the idea of taking a short segment from one record and putting it over the beat of another record. So, for instance, taking a horn sound, a horn blast from one James Brown record, and then using that as a sort of horn hit on another record. And that was something he very typically did. Another thing that he really helps to develop, but apparently did not invent, is the next thing, which is, of course, scratching. One of the most notable techniques of DJing is, of course, scratching. And this was supposedly invented by Grand Wizard Theodore, and you can see him there. But it was really perfected in a lot of ways by Grandmaster Flash, and they knew each other. Grandmaster Flash considered Theodore to be something of almost like a student. And we're going to hear Grandmaster Flash in action. And actually, let's hear a little bit of him in action right now. This is a tune that he recorded later, obviously, called The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel. Or on the Wheels of Steel. The wheels of steel being the turntable.
Come on, girls, let's rock that.
There's some back spinning, a little bit of scratching, and then another cut. Cutting among these various records. Remember, he's just dealing with 2 turntables at this point, so he's flipping those records off in time to get to the next thing and so on. A little scratching there. Notice the way he sort of teases the beat with the back spinning there, but never loses control of the beat. And he really is amazing. He still goes around and performs. Here's some scratching. That's a pretty slick transition. You might be thinking to yourself, well, how hard is this to do? And you have all the time in the world in the studio. But he really does perform this way. He's really quite impressive. Now, we were talking about economics. Let's turn to the next slide here. And we see Sylvia Robinson of Sugar Hill Records. Sylvia Robinson was an R&B artist of some success. She hadn't had any success for a while by the time she found Sugar Hill Records. She was in Sugar Hill, right near where our school is, of course, right up the street from where our school is, the famous neighborhood in Harlem. And that's where she's getting the name of the record company. At this point, she's no longer living there. She's actually living in Jersey, but she did live there previously. And she and her husband, Joe, create Sugar Hill Records. And at first, the idea is more or less to try to bring back her own career and so on. But she hears a little bit of a rap performance at a club in the Bronx. I think it was like her sister's, no, it was her own birthday party that her sister had arranged for her or something along those lines. and she was astounded by it, and she thought that this was something that maybe she could record, and that she knew that there were some novelty records going around that were mostly DJs making fun of, radio DJs making fun of the whole thing. But she thought that maybe people could take it a little more seriously and still have it be a party record. And that's really how she was releasing it. As we might have discussed before, there were several party records that were released in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And these were records that were meant for limited, actually they go back to at least the 30s. They were meant for limited release. They were meant to be played. They were usually dirty records. They, were risque. For instance, Red Fox, the great comedian, had several party records that you would put on, and he'd tell dirty jokes, and you'd listen to it at a party. These weren't records meant for mass distribution. They were meant for a few people to buy them and enjoy them and laugh at them. And she kind of thought that that's what rap might offer. And she approaches a lot of these various MCs to see if they'd be willing to record for her. She approaches Lovebug Starsky. She approaches several other big-name DJs at the time, and they all turn her down. So what she winds up doing is something rather, well, odd. She approaches 3 young men, one of whom really didn't do much rapping at all up to that point. Another who only sort of rapped in an attempt to emulate people that he admired, some of the people who had turned Sylvia Robinson down for this recording. One of them was literally working at a fast food restaurant, and Sylvia's son said, oh, he raps a little bit while he's cooking as a line cook at this fast food restaurant. And they went and bothered him, while he was working, and had him come out to the car. She's just out in the car eating a burger that I guess he had just made, and he's in the back seat, rapping a little bit for her. And this is what she pulls together. In fact, there's a wonderful story when they were recording what's going to become Rapper's Delight. That fellow, the boss was upset that he called out of work, and Sylvia Robinson, I don't remember if she pretended to be his mother, but she basically called in the excuse for him so he wouldn't lose his job. This was expected to be, just like I said, a party record. It was expected to be a bit of income for Sylvia and her husband Joe. It wasn't expected to be what it became. What it became was the first top 40 rap single. It became the first real rap single. Everything else was just a novelty before that. And in some ways this was kind of designed to be a novelty, but it quickly became so much more. It became the number 4 R&B hit. And that's kind of amazing, considering that what we're dealing with is a record that featuring music of Les Chic, right? The song "Good Times," and then they're vocalizing over it, they're emceeing over it, they're rapping over it, and you'll hear this isn't very sophisticated rapping. These 3 weren't even really that good for their time. They didn't have careers yet. They wound up with careers, and they got better based on the success of this album. But it was a huge hit, 36 pop, which is very high for this kind of thing. Let's hear a little bit of this very famous, very celebrated recording from 1979. I should mention, I might have made a mistake. I might have made it sound like they're singing over a recording. They're not. And this is one of the ways that Sylvia Robinson tried to get out of a lawsuit. She actually had a band come and play this music, even though most of it, in fact, just about all of it, is copped from other recordings. There's a live band that she put together to play this. So it's not recording over a prefabricated album in the way that the actual culture was developing at the time. And she thought that this would get her out of copyright issues. We'll talk about that more in a second. Let's hear just the opening of the rap. We're running out of time on the slide. Okay, let's switch to the next slide. I don't want to wind up running out of time on the slide, so I'm going to steal from Curtis Blow just a little bit to talk a little bit more about that last recording. You can hear how it works. It reinforces the beat. Hip, hop, hippity hop, right? It's not the most innovative rapping by any means, and it's not meant to be. Party rap tends to reinforce the underlying beat. It tends to call attention to aspects of the record that's playing underneath it. It's meant to keep the party moving. In fact, a lot of the lines, in fact, one of the things that wound up becoming a legal issue is a lot of these lines are stolen from other working rappers of the time. The idea of copywriting any of this wasn't really in the culture quite yet. And so some of these lines are just kind of in the air. They're just used from rap to rap. And these guys didn't mind obviously borrowing. One of them even asked permission, and the guy didn't take it very seriously, didn't think it would become anything. So he said, yeah, sure, go ahead and use my lines. Obviously, he was upset about that later. Now, one of the first full albums to get released, and certainly on a major record label, because as often happened with independent labels, Sugar Hill wasn't able to keep up with the demand for that record. And so now, quite early on, the major labels begin to take an interest, and Mercury Records is one of the first, and they sign Curtis Blow. Part of this has to do with the very famous, very celebrated Quincy Jones, who was very quickly becomes a top hip-hop producer. He's the one that convinced Mercury Records to expand in this way. He also was the publisher of Vibe magazine, which is very important in the beginnings of hip-hop history. So Curtis Blow signs, it's the first major label, and releases this song, The Breaks, in 1980. And again, notice the way that party rap works. Notice the way it reinforces the beat.
Clap your hands, everybody, if you got what it takes. Because I'm Curtis Blow, and I want you to know that these are the breaks.
Again, a real band, now with new music.
Breaks in a bus, breaks on the car, breaks to make you a superstar, breaks to win and breaks to lose. But these here breaks will rock your shoes, and these are the breaks. Break it up, break it up, break it up.
So notice how the lines here, both the sense of rhyming, for the most part, is very couplet oriented, right? You have one line that's answered by the next line, and those two lines both obviously rhyme. There's not, at this point, there's not much internal stuff happening with the lines, not many internal rhymes. There's, for the most part, it's at best 16th note driven, a lot of it's eighth notes, and you tend to have an emphasis on 1 and 3 in the vocal part that reinforces the emphasis on 1 and 3 in the drum part. Sometimes the emphasis goes over to 4. It depends on the specific rap, but there's a regularity here. One of the bands that really becomes important in this and starts to break some of that regularity is, of course, Grandmaster Flash. He puts together, for a while, he has a group of 3 MCs, and then he puts together the Furious 5. Not all of these MCs are equally important. Obviously, Melly Mel is in many ways the most important of them. But you have the Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 here. One of the important things about them, of course, is their 1982 song, The Message. You can see from this slide that Flash, of course, originally played with Curtis Blow and Lovebug Starsky. He played with many MCs, but then he puts together his own group. At first, it's the 3 MCs with Cowboy, Melly Mel, and Kid Creole, and then Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 with Raheem and Scorpio. Who are in some ways hype men, and we'll come back to what the hype man is soon. At first they signed with Enjoy Records in '79 and then Sugar Hill. And it's on Sugar Hill that they have this release, which was a number 4 on the R&B charts. It's one of the first serious raps or rap releases, and it's called The Message, and it features Melly Mel. And you can hear that the song begins with these, again, a kind of Afro-futurist sound, these futuristic synth sounds, or at least what would have constituted futuristic sounds in the early 80s. And when he begins, when we hear Melly Mel in a moment, he's going to begin with the refrain. So now we have one of the first rap songs with a very clear refrain here. Such as Jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. And that'll return several times throughout the song.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Which he repeats right away.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
And then goes into the verse.
Broken glass everywhere. People pissing on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise. Got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a touch repossessed my car. Don't push.
Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff already happening in this song that we might point out. But notice again the early rap style of reinforcing the beat so that it's very regular what he's doing. What's not regular, though, and what makes Melly Mel special, besides the part that we're about to hear that we haven't heard yet, is the articulative aspects of what he's doing, right? Listen to the way he's using pitch. Listen to the way he's articulating certain words. Listen to the way he allows certain things to go a little past their rhythmic point of delivery. There's a lot of character to what he's doing. It's not simply rhythmical speech. I'm going to back it up just a little, and then we're going to get into the don't push me because I'm close to the edge, another aspect of a sort of refrain within this song.
Can't take the noise, got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a touch repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me...
So notice there's several things. That rhythmical laugh, right, which feels so sort of sarcastic and yet interesting and rhythmical. And the way the edge, the way he holds out certain words and then gives them a pitch relationship that adds to the character. Now, rap really takes a turn already by December 81, or it begins to show that it's going to take a turn. And a lot of this has to do, and you can hear this, by the way, on YouTube, and I encourage you to do so. It has to do with this moment in December of 81, which was at Harlem World, one of the really important clubs in Harlem from the time, a very important place for early hip-hop culture. And it's often considered the first rap battle. It's not really the first rap battle. There were others, but they were all tame. They were sort of these little contests. It wasn't a big deal, but this was a kind of convention for MCs. And Busy Bee Starsky, who you can see there holding the microphone out, he is one of the great party DJs. He's not as celebrated in the history books as, in part because of this, as Lovebug Starsky. But Busy Bee Starsky was quite good with the party DJing. He knew how to, as they put it at the time, he knew how to rock a crowd and how to keep the party going. And he's at this convention, which extended over a good part of 81 into the new year. It was sort of a New Year's convention, more or less, for rappers in early hip-hop. And he's up there, and he's not exactly bad-mouthing Kool Moe Dee. He kind of like MCs do. He announces who's there. And I forget exactly what it is he says, but Kool Moe Dee doesn't take it very well. And you can see Kool Moe Dee over to the left. And so he decides that he's going to take Busy Bee Starsky's DJ. He's going to ask him to perform behind him, to DJ behind him, and he's going to improvise a rap. Now, if you know Kool Moe Dee's output at the time, some of the things that he says, he's clearly building on things that he's previously written, but he's also clearly tailoring some of what he's doing here to the moment. So this is an early example of real freestyle rap. It's also an early example of a true rap battle, and just the flexibility. This is a very different kind of DJing, of MCing, than what Busy Bee Starsky's doing, and I encourage you to listen to it on YouTube to get a sense of it. So now we're talking about the distinction from the old school to the new school in the way that it would have been used in the mid 80s, right? Old school rap or party rap lasts until roughly 1984, where we have the beginning of the new school, or what's sometimes called golden age of rap. The lyrics are party oriented. There might be a concern with Afrofuturism, as we saw with Africa Bambaataa. It's relatively simple flow, and flow is just the rhythmic delivery, or just the textual delivery of the rapper. So there are relatively few syllables per measure. It tends to be eighth note driven, even if there are some 16th notes. There's emphasis on specific beats that get repeated over and over again. Moderate tempos. The samples are mostly from disco and funk. Sometimes the live band is used. But then you have the move to the new school, or the golden age, which starts somewhere around 83, 84. A heavier use of drum machines, not just samples, much more aggressive and assertive lyrics, especially with a political bent, as we'll see in Public Enemy and certain other groups, or at least a mildly political one. Sometimes it's not so much about overt politics, like with Run DMC, it's not exactly politics so much as representing kind of a more authentic sense of street life, whatever that might mean. The songs tend to be shorter, right? A lot of the songs we've been listening to, the one that we were just talking about, is in its original version 7.5 minutes long. Now we're going to move toward radio single lengths, so songs that are 3.5 minutes long. So there's more of an attempt to get radio play. There's often, especially with Run DMC, a kind of rock influence going on. There's also an interest in the hip-hop album, which really wasn't a part of hip-hop prior to that. So the artists project a harder-edged b-boy style with a more minimalist approach to the music, as opposed to the novelty or funk elements of the old school. The first big release, of course, was Sucker MCs in 1983 by Run DMC. And this was an album that really changed the entire game, that changed the entire approach. Let's hear just a little bit of it.
2 years ago, a friend of mine asked me to say some MC rhyme, so I said this rhyme I'm about to say. The rhyme was there, but then it went this way. Took a test to become an MC, and Orange Cliff became amazed at me, so Larry put me inside, strapped to lack. The show drove off, and we never came back. Dave cut the record down to the bone, and now they got me rocking on the microphone, and then we talking autographs, tears and laughs, champagne, caviar, and bubble bath. You see, that's the...
Now again, notice he's reinforcing the beat. It's not that there's a sudden break in a totally new thing, and yet there's a little more fluidity here, and the topics of the lyrics is different, right? Instead of it being about trying to make the party better or get people involved in the party, he's calling out other people that aren't at his level of performance. So there's an athleticism that comes into play, and Run DMC becomes one of the first true crossover groups. Even though some people might treat Run DMC in some ways as a kind of novelty group, they're really not. I mean, the way they're dressing, there's no Afrofuturism element here. They're really distinct from the earlier part of DJ and MC culture. You can see, they wear the heavy chains and the Adidas jackets. Adidas, of course, being a major part of their brand, of what they feel they're about, but for the most part, they're dressing the way that they dress, or at least their claim is that they dress the same way that they would have dressed on the street, and just go up. The one difference might be the hats, really. Maybe the exaggerated chains in this particular picture. Here's, Sucker MCs, the release. So the first major release, and when you read the biographies of early hip-hop artists, almost everyone refers to this recording as being a major moment in their realization that there's something else to do. There's that hip-hop had taken a turn from being just something that people did in the neighborhood to something that you could actually make a living off of, that you could actually do in the world as a form of art. And here is the major album, Raising Hell from 1986. This was the album that really changed it all in some ways. If Sucker MCs was the song that sort of initiated it, Raising Hell was the album that showed that this was album-driven music, that this was a real form of art, especially with songs like Peter Piper, It's Tricky, My Adidas, and Walk This Way. Let's hear a little bit of It's Tricky, one of the most famous rap songs, and you'll hear that we still have that delivery, right? But notice the acceleration that happens here. So we'll hear it in a second, but everyone knows the beginning, right? The speech is my recital. So the emphasis on speech and then recital. I think it's very vital, but then it accelerates to rock a rhyme that's right on time, so that you get this acceleration into the refrain, which is, of course, it's tricky. So let's hear the beginning of it.
This speech is my recital. I think it's very vital to rock around. That's right. On top. Here we go.
And then the guitar part with those octaves.
On time is tricky. It's tricky. It's tricky to rock around. That's right. On time is tricky. Tricky. I met this little girlie. Her hair was kind of curly. Went to her house and bust her out. I had to leave real early.
So you have these stories that are starting to emerge within rap. You have the references to rock. It becomes more accessible. It becomes more palatable. And of course, the song "Walk This Way," which is they were rapping over a tune by Aerosmith, right? And we're going to allude to Aerosmith a little more later. But obviously, Aerosmith was a band that was pretty popular in the 70s, and at this moment, not quite as popular anymore. They're about to have their comeback, and part of their comeback really does depend on this release. Let's hear just a tiny bit of the opening. So that opening drum beat, and then they let the guitar in, or they start to. And so they're rapping over and using his lyrics. Apparently, originally, Run would use this song as one of his vehicles, but he just wanted the drum beat. He said, I would get mad at the DJ if he let that guitar come in. But then it was Rick Rubin that convinced them to do the actual lyrics and to do it with Aerosmith in the choruses. And Rick Rubin, of course, is one of the minds behind Def Jam Records, one of the most important album companies or record companies of this period, of this style. And it's really Russell Simmons and Rick Rubin who are at the center of this thing. Let's look at some facts about Def Jam. Founded by Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons in the dorms of NYU. They're students at NYU. Russell Simmons was very, at first he was one of the people who just put up flyers for Kool Herc and for other of these parties, these early hip-hop parties. So he's involved in the beginning, but he begins to, while he's at NYU, he begins to think like an entrepreneur, and he becomes one of the great hip-hop entrepreneurs. They release a tune called It's Yours by T-La Rock. Let's hear just the very opening of it. And that's Jazzy J as the DJ.
Commentating, illustrating, description giving, adjective expert, analyzing some other musical myth, seeking people of the universe. This is yours.
You might have noticed T-La Rock is actually, he has a very interesting sense of flow. If we have more time, we would talk more about it. But it really stands out. But it was this release, it was LL Cool J's 1985 release, I Can't Live Without My Radio, that really made Def Jam Records take off. Let's hear just a tiny bit of it. Notice the minimalism here, right? Not a lot of stuff going on. Some percussion sounds.
I like it loud. I'm the man with the box that can rock the crowd. Walking down the street to the hardcore beat while my JVC vibrates the concrete. I'm sorry if you can't understand, but I need a radio inside my hand. Don't mean to offend other citizens, but I kick my volume way past 10. My story is rough. My neighbor.
So LL Cool J, of course, you can mark in some ways transitions in hip hop through his career, and this is an important one. This move into the golden era. Their house, Def Jam, included Public Enemy, Run DMC, which they were managed and produced by Def Jam, but they were officially on Profile Records. DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and of course we already heard Tila Rock. They had LL Cool J for a while. And then the Beastie Boys, which really was Rick Rubin's baby in some ways. This trio of white performers who used to be in a rock band and then turned to rap. At first probably really as a sort of gimmick, and then wind up doing something quite special with it. Their album, Licensed to Ill, is the first #1 rap album. It was #2 R&B in 1986. It's also one of the first albums to use digital sampling instead of turntables, and we'll listen to a bit of it in a moment. And of course, one of the most important bands in this era and Def Jam Records was Public Enemy. In 1988, their second album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, reaches Pop 42 and R&B #1 with the song, which was R&B #18, Don't Believe the Hype, which I talk about in my analysis for this session. And of course, they have Fear of a Black Planet. We'll talk about how they work in just a second. I don't want to run out of time on this slide. Here's a picture of Run DMC with Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons, and you can see them over toward the right. And then, of course, Run DMC in the middle there. Here's Tila Rock, who we heard. LL Cool J from around this time. And here are the Beastie Boys. Let's hear a little bit of their album, this very successful album, Licensed to Ill. And of course, the most famous song from it was Fight for Your Right, which was a mainstay on mid-80s MTV.
Yeah!
Obviously, you still have the rock elements here with the distorted guitar. And you can hear, obviously, there's still an element of party rap to all this, and novelty rap, but there's also the very heavy influence of rock and roll. Here's the cover for that album. This is one of those albums that in 1986 there was no way you were going to get away from. It was everywhere. They followed up with the much less successful, but probably artistically superior, Paul's Boutique. This is an amazing album and is really worth listening to. It's one of the great examples of how sampling becomes very sophisticated very fast. Let's hear just a little bit of Sounds of Science.
Now here we go, dropping science, dropping it all over, like bumping around the town, like when you're driving a Range Rover. Expanding the horizon, expanding the parameters, expanding the rhymes of sucker MC amateurs. A novel, Isaac Newton, a scientific easy. A Ben Franklin with a kite, a getting over with the key. Now rock, shut up.
Now you can still hear the emphasis on certain beats, and there's definitely a certain regularity, but that regularity is becoming a bit more interesting here. Now, one of the great examples of flow and of rhythmic interest in rap is, of course, Chuck D from Public Enemy. Public Enemy is really a fascinating group, and you're going to see my analysis for this week, which is going to be written instead of a video, in part to give you a example of the kinds of things you might write about in your paper on Biggie Smalls and rap. This is one of the really fascinating groups, and I talk more about why they're fascinated in that, so I won't take up time here doing that. But this album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, one of the most important albums, of course, of that period. And here's one of the most important songs of that period, Don't Believe the Hype. Let's hear just the opening of it.
Some people never know. The enemy could be the Frank Guardian. I'm not.
Now, this is the same time period as the other things we're listening to, but it's like taking a quantum leap in sophistication when it comes to the actual rapping. Notice the use of enjambment, the use of much more of a variety of rhymes. There's some internal rhymes, not a ton yet, that's coming later, but there's some internal rhymes. There's a mixture of where the emphasis goes. There's still a tendency to emphasize the end of beat 3 or beat 4 as the ends of these lines. There's still an overall couplet sensibility, but he also uses a poetic device called enjambment, where one line runs on into the next, and sometimes it's hard to tell where one begins and one ends. So there's a lot more sophistication here. Here, of course, is their 1990 album, Fear of Black Planet, which had Fight the Power, one of their biggest releases. It was the main song for Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, a very important movie of that period, and helped to bring them to superstardom. Another group of this period, and the last we're going to talk about, is Eric B. and Rakim. Very different approach to how rap works. Their first release was Eric B. as President, which then later became part of their first album, Paid in Full. Let's hear just a tiny bit of it.
To show our appreciation for your support. Thank you, DJs.
I never let the mic magnetize me no more, but it's fighting me, inviting me to rhyme. I can't hold it back. I'm looking for the line.
So along with Chuck D, notice the much more interesting set of rhythms. And also there's a sort of developmental aspect to the way that Rakim raps, right? That he starts with a kind of old school approach, just reinforcing the main beats. But then he moves on from that to a new rhythmic profile. He introduces the run in 16th note bit, the groups of 3, and he continues that for a little bit. Then he moves on to the next thing. So they formed in Long Island, and they're part of the Queens style. They're in some ways under the tutelage of Marley Marl, who, if we have more time, we talk more about. I don't think he's necessarily the most interesting rapper, but he tends to get himself involved in a lot of other groups that are more interesting, either as an adversary, as we'll see later when we talk about KRS-One, who had a bit of a beef with Marley Marl, or as a kind of tutor in a sense, or a producer, as he was for Eric B. and Rakim, although he becomes sort of their adversary because he wants to take more credit than they felt he deserved. But their follow-up, they were somewhat disappointed in Paid in Full. Paid in Full, by the way, amazing album and definitely worth listening to, but they were somewhat disappointed. They felt it was rushed. So the next album was the one that was what they felt really represented what they were up to. And that features the song Lyrics of Fury, which I think is one of the great examples of this period, of this era period, but also of Rakim's skill as a lyricist and a performer. Let's hear just a bit of this.
It's quite frightening, but don't be afraid in the dark, in the fog, not a scream or a cry or a bark, more like a spark. Simple like an alcoholic, muscles tighten up. What's that lighten up? You see a sight, but slowly you feel like you're in a horror flick. Grab your heart and whisper tomorrow quick. Music's a clue when I come, you warn. Apocalypse now, when I'm done, you're gone. Haven't you ever heard of an MC murderer? This is a death penalty, and I'm serving her. Death wish, so come on, step to this miracle. I did for a lyrical perfectionist.
Notice that the notion of internal rhyme almost breaks down here, right? I mean, there are internal rhymes, and if you look carefully at the lyrics, you can see the basic structure. But there are so many internal rhymes that it's almost like he's chopping up into these smaller poetic line units that then change the pace of the whole whole delivery. The rhythmic sophistication, both in the way that he uses rhyme, in the way that he uses enjambment, having one line run into the other, in the way that he uses the placement with respect to the overall meter, all of that is so much more sophisticated, especially along with Chuck D, than really anything else of the era. They are the two that really move us into the 90s and into this greater level of sophistication that we'll see with Biggie Smalls especially, but with other rappers as well. So that's it for this particular lecture. Thanks for listening. I know I went a little over what the time allotment usually is, and I will see you next time for session 20. Thanks.